are all up over 60%. These are staggeringly bad numbers, and they were fueled directly by the reckless spending spree that Democrats rammed through on party line just last year. Remember, right before the $2 trillion spending spree, President Biden said, quote, "The biggest risk is not going too big. It's if we go too small."
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen actually told NBC News that this is not an economy that's in a recession, but we're in a period of transition in which growth is slowing. Yellen also noted that there are threats on the horizon, however. At any other time, a president presiding over a 3.6% unemployment rate would expect his approval rating to be around 50% and be cruising to a second term. But Biden's job performance rating has slumped into the 30s, and Democrats are bracing for big losses in midterm elections in November. Inflation has already raced to 40-year highs on the back of raging demand and crisis-compromised supply chain issues. In short, almost everything got more expensive this year, especially the everyday expenses that most Americans cannot afford, like food and housing and gas. In a recent poll, 75% of Americans called inflation and the cost of living the most important economic problem facing their family. Expect several key reports this week on U.S. economic, health, and consumer prices to offer everybody a glimpse of how bad things could get. On Wednesday, the Federal Reserve is also expected to raise interest rates again in an attempt to tame inflation, though some experts think the Fed's new aggressive strategy came too late and does risk the economy falling into a recession. It's also been 13 years since the last time the U.S. federal minimum wage was raised to $7.25 an hour. This is the longest period without a raise since the federal minimum wage was enacted in 1938. That can't be helping President Biden in the face of dismal poll numbers. Only 80% of Americans in that CNN survey described the nation's economy as in good shape, while 82% said economic conditions are poor. Everybody, millions of Social Security recipients and seniors may be able to receive a $1,400 stimulus check, and lawmakers from the Democrats and Republicans have also proposed new Social Security legislation that includes changes to monthly benefits. Now everybody scorching on inflation is inflicting financial pain on millions of people, but the rising price of everyday necessities has squeezed one group in particular. That is retirees that are living on a fixed income. And although Social Security recipients receive a COLA that is indexed to inflation, the amount of benefits exempted from tax has remained unchanged for decades. Since 1984, retirees have owed taxes on their benefits. If their income that includes their Social Security payments is more than $25,000, if they are single, or $32,000 if they're a married couple. Individuals who earn more than $35,000 and couples who earn more than $44,000 can be taxed on up to 85% of their benefits. But everybody, experts say that the hottest inflation in a generation could ultimately push more seniors into higher tax brackets.
Our core inflation rate here in America is more than 2 percentage points higher than in Europe. Inflation is uniquely bad here because our all-Democratic government has made uniquely bad choices. And now American families are dealing with the fallout every single day. It's no secret how much the American people disapprove of the course Washington Democrats have put us on. They say so in poll after poll after poll. So you might think by now that our colleagues would be ready to try a different approach. Well, guess again, President Biden and his party, fresh off the spending America into inflation, now want to tax hike us into recession. They're behind closed doors playing around with what may amount to the single largest tax increase in American history. Tucked inside are exactly the sort of radical ideas that working families can least afford right now. They want a giant tax hike on pass-through small businesses, a category, listen to this, that encompasses 95% of all businesses in the country, 95% of them. Take it from a constituent of mine in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, who put it this way: small businesses are already in a struggle to survive with all the taxes and regulations we have to deal with. Adding another tax is only making things worse. Democrats also want a so-called methane fee that amounts to a big new tax on domestic natural gas. While their inflation has pushed American families' natural gas prices and electricity costs up through the roof already. If following reckless spending and runaway inflation with a gigantic, painful tax hike sounds like a bad idea to you, Believe me, you're not alone. Even some House Democrats are lighting their hair on fire over what a terrible idea these discussions are. One House Democrat from New Jersey is telling reporters that she is, quote, not for any type of legislation that raises taxes, especially right now as my constituents are facing inflation, cost of living increases, and housing prices. Well, Madam President, let me put it this way. When House Democrats from the Northeast start trying to sound more like Ronald Reagan running against Jimmy Carter, you know they've gotten themselves into a fix. Too bad every single House Democrat except one and every single Senate Democrat voted for the $2 trillion mistake that brought us to where we are. The Democrats complaining about inflation today voted in lockstep for the bill that brought us here. And now their answer to picking families' pockets once is to now pick the families' pockets yet a second time. The same Democrats who spent us into inflation now want to tax us into recession. Now, on an entirely different matter, this week I've been discussing the historic term the Supreme Court just concluded, the most consequential and pro-Constitution term since Brown overturned Plessy almost 70 years ago. Back in 2015, in one fell swoop, the Obama-Biden administration took aim at domestic energy production, harmed the separation of powers, and attacked the rule of law. Remember, after Americans elected Republicans in 2010 to place a check on the left-wing agenda, President Obama infamously said he would just ignore the will of the people and work around Congress. Here was his quote. He said, "I've got a pen." He said, "I've got a phone." Thus began a whole series of unconstitutional power grabs by the executive branch, a sort of crime spree against the Constitution. For example, when Democrats could not get harmful and unpopular environmental restrictions through Congress because the people's duly elected representatives did not support them, the bureaucrats at the Obama EPA decided to pretend that some obscure lines in an old law actually gave them enormous sweeping regulatory powers to manage our economy, which nobody had ever noticed before. The EPA effectively wrote and passed a giant piece of legislation, the so-called Clean Power Plan, as one branch of government acting alone. They tried to make law without involving actual lawmakers. The Obama EPA just up and decided they would start giving orders and issuing edicts and remake our country's electricity grid by brute force. Of course, the pretext was simply false.